Hello, hello. So happy today to have Love-Ese Chile join us. And Love-Ese is the managing owner of Regenerative Waste Labs. So happy to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation today.
So I'm going to start where I usually start, but yours is a little more interesting because when I was reading about you, I found that you have an influence of Captain Planet on you, and that
Yes.
your journey on passion around sustainability started around age 8. So I would love to hear your growing up years and what influences you had that led you to where you are now.
Yeah. Yes, I was a avid lover of cartoons, that's for sure. So my family, I guess maybe my story is kind of classic for this changing world that we live in. My parents are from Nigeria, which is in Western Africa. A country rich in so many different things, but also challenged by the colonial history that kind of ties us all together around this world. And so my parents moved from Nigeria to the South Pacific, so first landing in Australia, where my dad got a Nigerian or a Commonwealth scholarship to go to university there. They had my elder brother and myself in Australia before we all moved as a family to New Zealand, which is where I spent the majority of my formative years. For those who've ever been to New Zealand, it's a wonderful and fantastic place. It's really beautiful people, beautiful environment and ecosystem. The challenge that I had, though, was obviously my family was not originally from there. So I was often viewing the world from my very mixed cultural lens. Like at home, I was working like with my family from Nigeria, but then most of my peers were young people whose families had been in New Zealand for quite a long time. And so I feel like kind of growing up with that different perspective and my general aptitude and love for math led me to be a scientist very early on. So really seeking to find answers in the natural world, which might help me understand all of the different and somewhat sometimes confusing things that I saw in this culture that I found myself in. So for me, science was really a tool that I used both to kind of exceed in school and realize that that's something I was really good at, but also to help me understand kind of the fundamentals of how things worked and the building blocks of our universe. But at the same time, I also had a scientist's mind. So I was very inquisitive, wanting to really understand the reasons why we do certain things. And so, as you mentioned, I was an avid fan of Captain Planet when I was a kid growing up. I loved cartoons. Like, I think many children of migrant parents know that they're often working, so you're left to your own devices, and cartoons are really just quite fun for any kids, I'm sure. But that kind of raised certain things to me that, we had this impact on our environment and our ecosystem. And so I really had questions about why people were doing certain things and how they could be done better. And so I feel like those initial roots of just being very open to questioning some of the things around me, because my perspective was so different from the other people I saw and the ways that they were doing things. I feel like that initial kind of lust for understanding and knowledge is what's driven me throughout my career so far. So yeah, a bit about my background for sure.
That's beautiful, well put. And interestingly, I have great stories from all three countries you mentioned: Nigeria, Australia, New Zealand. I've spent time in all, not that much in Nigeria because Nigeria really shook me. So
Yes.
I'm a traveler and I did not manage to last in Nigeria very long, to be honest. But that said, I have great friends who've lived in Nigeria, who live in Nigeria now. And I obviously hear many, many beautiful stories from Nigeria and, of course, Nollywood, as they would call it.
Yes.
But Australia and New Zealand are also very high in their awareness around sustainability. Did
Mhm.
that have an influence on you? Was that something part of the parlance when you were growing up in terms of discussions? Because each time I've been to both of these countries, I find the general awareness amongst people is much higher than the other places. Is that something
Mhm.
that you agree with or disagree with?
I would definitely think so. I think growing up there was this idea of being a tidy Kiwi. As people who may not know, but New Zealanders we call ourselves Kiwis after our national bird. And I feel that the culture around sustainability comes from our indigenous roots. I feel like of all of the countries that have been colonized by European powers, New Zealand has been doing a fantastic job of incorporating and uplifting and upholding the relevance and importance of Indigenous ways of doing and seeing the world. Not to say that we do things fantastically. I think there's always room for improvement when we're thinking about Indigenous relations. But that Māori culture and that perspective of being one with our ecosystem and our environment and making sure that we are stewards to our land. I think that idea of stewardship runs right through the underlying culture in New Zealand. And even white colonists, being very primarily farmers and being, seeing the value in our environment. Obviously, in some cases, that's been very extractive, but I feel like that culture of farming, that underlying Indigenous sense of stewardship has really driven the way that New Zealand sees our the way that we need to protect the way that we impact our ecosystems. And I do really think that was a great culture to be growing up in. I think that's I'm very lucky in that sense to feel that connection to the world around me quite deeply. And I do really believe that has been a driving force for me wanting to maintain that on a larger scale than just New Zealand, because New Zealand is a relatively small country and geographically quite far away from kind of the bigger players in this global scene. And so I left New Zealand really with the desire to understand some of this larger perspective and see where I could make an impact, where there may be a greater impact to the work that I could do.
And what about the Nigerian culture? If you look at the deeper, more sort of root culture, does that have a connection to ecology as well?
Yeah, I've been very unfortunate to not have spent very much time in Nigeria myself throughout my life, and that's for various different reasons, as you alluded to, the culture in Nigeria, and just because of the history, it's very challenging. It's not always the safest place for everybody, and so there's been some conscious choices to kind of quote unquote protect me from that. But one of the things which I think about that I have gained from being a Nigerian is my entrepreneurial skills. You may or may not remember the Nigerian scammers of the early internet ages. But that really highlights to me that the entrepreneurial spirit of Nigerians. And I feel like my father once shared with me a statistic about the number of Black business owners in North America, and a large percentage of those are Nigerians, people who either immigrated from Nigeria or first or second generation migrants. And so just that ability to kind of be willing to put your impact on the world, I really do think came from my Nigerian roots. And I'm excited to spend some more time in Nigeria and really see that reflected in the world around me when I go.
And one of the questions I've been waiting to ask you is your beautiful name. How does that come about, Love-Ese?
Yes, that's actually it's a family name. My parents' names it comes from my parents' names essentially. My father's name is Love, and my mother's Tiv name, which is our tribe in Nigeria, is Awesi. And so they took Love and Ese and put it together, and that's how they created me. So.
That's much simpler than what I had thought, Okay, there'll be a longer story to how they imagined this beautiful name. But I know so many of the Nigerian names are so direct sometimes, right? It
Mm.
could be something like talent, and it could be,
Yes.
so it's really cool to hear that. And then, of course, you go ahead and do a Bachelor of Science in organometallic chemistry. Like, how did you even think that you wanted to go that specific? Okay, chemistry, fine, I understand. But why that specific? How did that come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I was necessarily meaning to be that specific, to be honest. What I found, so chemistry has always been a great passion of mine. Just understanding, for a long time I was a chemistry purist, thinking that chemistry is the central science, and it really is. It does connect to all the other sciences, but we do have to go through physics at some point, but it's neither here nor there. So so I really got into chemistry, and organometallic chemistry is the study of I guess the interaction and the interrelation and the properties of metal ions when they become enshrouded with carbon and hydrogen kind of chemical motifs, if we want to call them. And so when we look into nature, a lot of the catalysts for really fascinating transformations in natural systems are propagated by metal organic frameworks. And so we can think about the heme of our blood molecules. Inside of is a heme is a molecule which is kind of circular, and in the center of that is the atom iron. And so that molecule is what's important for binding oxygen that then transfers throughout our bodies. And then similarly, we have chloroform as well. There, I think it's copper, not copper, I think it's cobalt, but I'm not entirely sure. But once again, we have a metal organic framework. We have this really amazing transformation of, which is even more fantastic, of energy into a chemical system through this one molecule. And so I was really interested in organometallic frameworks because of the interesting, like, rapid changes that they're able to facilitate in nature. And yeah, so my bachelor's degree was really looking at the what's called the ligand, so the organic motif, and how we can create more interesting motifs. And so I think my bachelor's thesis was really around, I believe the application was for drug delivery. So how can we start to deliver drugs closer to the actual, the cancer site to be able to facilitate some sort of transformation and then potentially impact that biological system. And so similarly, when I went to do my PhD, I was looking at another organic metallic framework, but this one was intended to create a bio-based plastic. And so it was really, I was kind of very fascinated with electrons and atoms when I first started into chemistry. The main question I had was, if atoms are 99% empty space, how come when I touch something, my atoms don't just kind of merge with the atoms of that thing? And why, why do we have a solid physical world, essentially? But I soon learned about electrons, and that's where the repulsion between electrons is what keeps atoms apart. And so all of that was just so fascinating to me, to really understand, like, at the molecular level, why things are able to be solid or liquid or in different types of structures. So yeah, it was just another kind of mechanism to learn more about matter and what makes it tick, so to speak.
That's so interestingly put. So, of course, my background is not in science, but what I've always been fascinated with is nature's building blocks. And you kind of inferred to that idea when you were talking about it. And my very, very basic understanding is basically that most materials consist of sugars and amino acids or proteins.
Mm-hmm.
How does, when you look at what you were talking about in terms of the interaction with metals, how does that play a role when you look at nature's packaging, or whatever, even materials in general? How does that blend in with this idea of proteins and sugars?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I came from it from a different lens, like a kind of as I mentioned, I was kind of a chemistry purist, and I never actually did a single biology class throughout my scientific upbringing because of that one reason. I was just like, chemistry is the real place to be. And so I actually came from, like, now I'm like, I love biology. I love the interaction between biology, because biology is just chemistry, but like solidified, essentially. You're actually seeing the chemistry in action. And so when you're studying chemistry, you're really just studying the theories of those building blocks, but biology puts those theories into action, which is really fascinating. So for me, as I mentioned, I had this interest in electrons and how charges, I guess, interact with each other. And so when I started my PhD thesis, as I mentioned, I was doing this catalysis side, so making catalysts to start to build those polymer chains, bringing the building blocks together and starting to link them into these long chains, which are plastics, essentially. And so my project was interdisciplinary. I was doing chemistry and chemical engineering, but I actually had to learn all of the engineering like almost within the first 6 months so I could actually make my project work. And so what was really exciting, what I like, yeah, it was very challenging at the time, but now it's like one of the most impactful things that I've ever learned was polymer physics, or the way that polymer chains change when you change the temperature and the pressure, the temperature and the pressure, I believe. The study of rheology, so how things flow. And so that's where I really started to learn about supermolecular interactions. So when we go moving from just electrons interacting to atoms interacting to small molecules interacting, to now like how do these long polymer chains interact with each other, and how does that then impact the properties of the plastic that I'm making at the end? And so once again, I'm learning all these theories, which will eventually come into play when I start down my pathway of looking into bio-based materials and things like that. But what was, one of the most, I ended up having to learn, what was it? Vector calculus, which is crazy, which is essentially what you're trying to understand is within a certain like unit square, what are the different interactions between that molecule or that polymer chain, and how can we find different ways to measure that using different, scientific techniques. But the math was kind of a bit outlandish to me, but this is kind of where this, my storytelling really kind of started to come out, because I ended up just thinking about polymer chains like spaghetti, like long spaghetti chains, which are like, you can imagine your bowl of spaghetti and each one of those chains is a polymer. And when you shake your bowl, they kind of all jiggle together. And that jiggling is really what I was learning. And so in this theoretical spaghetti world, you can, heat up your spaghetti chains and they start to, they're very hot and they start to move apart and they can flow a little bit more easily. But if you cool it down, you put your bowl into the freezer, those spaghetti chains start to lock together. And suddenly you have this very rigid structure that's going to be very strong. And so that's how that's how we can conceptualize the formation of plastics throughout how we heat it up to mold it and cool it down to make sure it's into that rigid structure. And that's essentially what proteins and other types of building blocks in nature are doing. They're using the intermolecular forces to hold them into place. And then heat and other types of agitation can make those things change. Or you can have things like electrons and different types of metal organic frameworks that come in and just like zap and make that system change even more, even in a greater way than just temperature and other types of like environmental changes. So throughout my schooling, I was really learning these different theories which could be that we see being applied in natural systems, but we can also see them being applied in synthetic systems as well. So we can understand how synthetic plastics and all of these other types of things coming from the oil and gas industry have come to be, because once again, we're just applying those chemistry principles, but to a synthetic human-made system, rather than kind of seeing those being emulated in our natural biological systems. So it was really quite interesting, and other than the actual science itself, which was complicated and very challenging. I mean, a 5-year PhD is no easy feat. But it was just, I was learning so much about the story of the science, and because once again, we can take these theories and apply them to, in a way that we use storytelling practices. And so once again, we can now start to communicate some of these complex ideas, but using the terminology of science. And so that was kind of a third layer that I was adding on top. It's just because of my general love of arts and things like that.
I love your analogy of spaghetti. It'll stay with me forever. Thank you so much for that. Thinking about heating up and cooling down, and that just creates such a clear image. And I think that, and I'm going to, after this question, I'm getting into your love for teaching and education. But before that, why shift to British Columbia for your PhD? And what made you choose the domain of bioplastics at all? Why
Yeah,
those
that's a
two
great
things?
question. So when I left, I finished my undergrad, and I think it was about 2010. And I was maybe 20, 22, 21, 22 years old. I got a full-time job. My first job out of undergrad was working at a wastewater treatment lab. And so we were just getting samples from water all across the region, and I was just in the lab figuring out how to test it for different analytes. So that was just a job I could do, which wasn't, I didn't want to work too hard being 21, 22, like I was still like wanting to have a good time with my life. But I felt like that was a good step to stay somewhat in the environmental field, but also kind of have this hands-on experience in the lab. But I knew that I wanted to have an impact. Like I've always, as I've mentioned at the top of the call, like I felt like just my perspective and the way that I just had this questioning about the world, and I still saw so much around me that I thought just didn't make any sense. Like surely there's a better way to do this. And one of the things which really, there's two devastating environmental things which I found out about just as I was thinking about what my next steps would be after about a year and a half working at that wastewater treatment lab. The first one was the BP oil spill into the Gulf of Mexico, which was just catastrophic. I think it was maybe 3 months of oil just spilling and spilling and spilling into the ocean. And then the other one was learning more and more about the plastics patch in the Pacific Ocean. So being from New Zealand, which is in the South Pacific, it felt very close to home to know that there is this giant island of plastics just accumulating. Now we know that there's like 7 of these islands in the ocean, which is even more alarming. But both of those things, like, because I just love science and chemistry, but I have been doing this work in environmental chemistry in the lab. And I continue to think, well, I've always been kind of interested in plastics, like this idea of plastics. The first thing which really kind of sparked my confusion about it was when just plastic water bottles became kind of a thing in New Zealand. I looked around and I was like, isn't this just water from a tap in a factory? Like, how is it actually any cleaner? And aren't we just creating plastic waste? But I asked that question of people around me and everyone just looked at me weird and didn't really answer. And I was just like, okay, I guess I'll stop asking that question now. So I felt like, okay, well, plastics seems to be the problem. Or, and if not plastics, then petroleum-based, like with oils. I was really, during the BP oil spill, they would deploy surfactants, and I was learning what surfactants are. So surfactants have one head which loves oil, and the other tail which loves water. And so they were saying that they were dispersing these surfactants to clean up the oil spill. But in my head, I was like, you're not cleaning anything, you're just making it water soluble. Like the oil is still there, it's just now biologically available, and isn't that going to be impactful? And why is that not part of the conversation? And so here I was, just kind of like a 22, 23-year-old, just being like, this seems like people aren't really telling the full story. And I felt inspired to figure out why and like what comes next. So yeah, so just like plastics, oil, it seemed like a natural fit. Moving to BC or Canada in a whole was kind of just me throwing an arrow at a map, to be honest. I wanted to move to an English-speaking country because that's the only language I speak currently. I wasn't super enthused about moving to the US for various reasons, and I can assume the audience may be able to guess. And Europe just seemed a bit daunting to me because it just seemed like, you know, the place where knowledge came from. It just seemed like I'm not sure how I can actually enter that system. It felt, yeah, just too big. Canada, like, didn't really know much about. Generally seemed like good people, good vibes. Choosing where in Canada is really like, where would I get in? So I just applied for a few different universities. The University of British Columbia popped up as somewhere I was accepted, and I was just like, BC seems nice. Like when I Googled it, it seemed like to be quite... There did seem to be Kiwis there, often on the ski hills, but that's fine. So I felt like if other New Zealanders are going here, this seems like a good enough place to be. So I pretty much jumped on a plane. I actually spent a month traveling around Europe with my friends before then flying to Vancouver, where after this month of just whirlwind, you can imagine Euro trip kind of adventures, then just landing in graduate school and starting like a 5-year journey to, it was just this is what's happening now, Essie, don't think about it too much, we're just doing it. So yes, that was a little bit of that pathway to kind of how I transitioned, but it really is kind of, indicative of a little bit of who I am. I'm really the type of person to sort of jump off a cliff and try to build my wings on the way down. Sometimes that leads to a bit of bruises, but I haven't finished that flight yet, so I'll definitely let you know how the ground looks.
That's a fascinating story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I love your thought also on the bottled water. I just find it to be such a marketing gimmick, and everybody
Mhm.
tends to fall for it. This is like clean water, and and if it is one thing, it's deprived from every mineral that your body needs. So it's
Yes,
so
exactly.
interesting that people, yeah, you do need clean water, no doubt about that. But it doesn't have to be a whatever couple of dollars worth of a
Hmm.
but of course, and most of the money goes into marketing. But then you're such a wonderful storyteller and a speaker, and that takes me well into what I was talking about before, that you've continuously looked at giving back towards education, teaching, and then you did it as a PhD student. But even after that, we see sustainable science camp, etc., etc. So where does and how does that fit into your journey, especially if we
Hmm.
keep moving chronologically from your PhD years forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I love talking, I guess. So when I was in high school, something that not too many people know about me. So I went to a performing arts high school. Essentially, I kind of followed my brother there because he was the actor in the family, and I ended up doing a lot of performing arts as well as science. And so I was probably the only person doing both of those streams, to be honest, or one of the few. So being on stage is just a whole nother thing. I've always really enjoyed being the center of attention, I guess. Maybe that's because I'm a Leo. But also just kind of, it's just such a vibe. And when I was in high school as well, I was also doing a lot of tutoring. And I think one of my first jobs that I started my own little tutoring business in my last year of undergrad, just to get some extra cash. And so, but what I really enjoyed, like, people just hated math. I think everyone, they either hate chemistry or they hate math in high school because generally they don't have a great teacher. But I was just so excited about those two topics. I would sit down with like people who maybe were like 2 years younger than me and just try to take them through and help them understand what I was already so passionate about. Like, it's not necessarily like the equation itself, but it's like how can this understand, like how can this information help us better understand the world around us, and then just trying to communicate that to the people that I was tutoring. And so for me, like, I do get nervous in front of crowds, but having the tools that I learned from being a performing artist in high school was really helpful because this allows you to kind of like, this is a performance, you're kind of going out there and you're sharing your information. And so, but the other side of that is just my deep desire to embed the science that I do in the community. So community-centered science is something that I learned about when I was in graduate school. I think I was searching for learning. So when I started grad school, I had this idea in my head, which is one of the reasons I didn't go to Europe, this idea of what science has, like, in the renaissance of science, what that was like. So you'd have kind of like very intelligent people sitting in libraries talking about philosophy and the economy and like all of these ideas kind of formulating in this melting pot. And that's what I was really excited about doing. Like, I wanted to talk to people who understood science and had a passion for it like I did, and then like understand how this work that we were doing would actually impact the world around us. I wanted to have those meaningful philosophical discussions with my peers. But when I actually got to graduate school, I learned that that's not what modern science is anymore, which was really disappointing to really be confronted with. Um, there's many things I learned in grad school. I think some of the negative experiences I had really highlighted to me how the institution has lost its way in some cases. It's not necessarily centering learning and understanding and communicating that to the broader society for the betterment of all. It's somewhat become lost in the metrics. The metrics of things like publishing, of how many high quality personnel are you generating, and that's not necessarily, I mean, those are metrics which once upon a time were very impactful for quantifying the value of that system. But for me, what was really important was what is the social impact that my research is having? And that was not a conversation that was being centered. And so I wanted to find ways to center that for myself. And so I started with something which I thought was relatively just like ridiculous, but it turns out to be really impactful. And for those around me, I started what I called the Science and Society Book Club. So I sent this email out to the grad students and I said, this is a book club. We're going to meet like every 2 weeks. We're going to read an excerpt from some sort of sci-fi fiction novel and then just discuss with our scientific brains like the impact that this novel had on science and then vice versa. And so I did that for like a year and a half. And that's how I found some of my closest friends in grad school, because I put it out there and I managed to bring the people who were as nerdy as I was into the same room. And we would have this conversation. And we read things like we didn't read the whole book because we were all grad students and no one has time. But we read A Brave New World, we read Frankenstein, we read so many different novels, like excerpts of them. But we just talked and we were just like, well, this is really interesting. And like just having this discourse about why science is important and how science is just another story that we tell each other and ourselves. But also the fact that many of us came into science because of stories that we were told. Like for me, Captain Planet, for example. I also read this amazing graphic novel that my brother shared with me called Transmetropolitan. And just completely outside of the actual purpose of that story was just this one instrument. It was called a maker. It's pretty much a 3D printer. But what would happen is that you would take trash, you would put it inside of the maker. The maker actually had its own AI, and you could just type in whatever you wanted, and it would take the components of that trash and turn it into the thing that you asked the maker to make. And I was just like, well, that's amazing, and that's perfectly within the realm of possibility of today. And this was like, maybe I don't want to say 2 decades, because that makes me feel incredibly old, but it was probably 2 decades ago. And but an interesting aside of that book is that the makers became sentient, started to print their own like synthetic drugs for themselves, and so you had these machines becoming like these drug addicts, and that was like a whole interesting aspect, I guess, of the AI story and what kind of comes next there. But it was just like us talking about how there's this feedback loop between the stories we tell ourselves, the science we do, and how that kind of continues to churn. At the same time as me searching for knowledge outside of the technical things I was learning, a friend of mine, we started to talk about science from a feminist perspective. That got us into the history of science, that got us into decolonizing science and all these different things. And just really learning about how the socioeconomic foundations and impacts of science, and really understanding and trying to unlearn how this system actually came to be and why we are kind of starved at my institution, at least, of this discourse as to why and how science should and could be done. And so that was just really impactful and eye-opening. And I thought to myself, well, one of the key things, so if you look at the scientific method, the 5th step of the scientific method is communication. You're supposed to be communicating your science to the general public in a way that people can understand. And that was the piece that was missing, and that was the piece that I decided to hyper-focus on, because it's like, well, what's the point of doing this amazing work? And like, we're generating amazing technologies, but what is the purpose if nobody knows about it, or no one can understand it, or no one can actually see how these technologies will actually be able to be implemented in the communities and used for a better tomorrow? And so through that, I was also doing things outside the university. One of the things I was doing was I went to meetups.com because I was much more confident back then. And I found this meetup group called the Shy Philosophers. And we were literally a group of random humans from the internet who would come together every Wednesday night, and we would talk about one random philosophical question. And everyone would sit in a circle and share their ideas about it. And it was one of the best things I've ever done. It was so much fun. But through that, I met somebody who was part of an organization called the Suzuki Elders. So here in Canada, there's a Suzuki Foundation, and there's a subsection of the Suzuki Foundation which is centered around elder knowledge and how we can incorporate the wisdom of our elders into with the activation of our youth to actually start to co-create ideas and solutions. So one of my last years of grad school, I brought the Suzuki elders into the chemistry department. I set up this whole workshop where we would be sharing information and the research that we did in sustainability with the Suzuki elders, take them on a tour and just learn from them and learn with them. And so that was one of my first opportunities to really like do this community education piece, which I activated me so much, and that's something I wanted to incorporate as I continued to move through my career. But yeah, that's kind of the starting off point, I guess.
Wow. You've packed a lot. You've unpacked a lot there. That's so amazing. I'm already a fan now.
Thank you.
But there's so many things that you actually touched on, and I'm just going to reiterate it from my perspective. First, of course, the idea of your love for stage. Also, it's so beautiful to see us discovering our holistic selves. So it's
Mhm.
not just the science Love-Ese. There is also a Love-Ese that loves to be on stage and talking and communicating. The idea of what you mentioned right in the beginning of a Nigerian entrepreneurial instinct, and you little mention of a tutoring business. I was like, that's interesting. And then, of course, you mentioned earlier on calculus, and then you talked about how it is about how do you teach people. And I remember math got lost to me. I was really good at math. And as soon as you start getting into high school and trigonometry and calculus starts getting in, and you don't have a good tutor, that's when you start losing it. You're like,
Mhm.
okay, I can't really figure this out. And that's something that came in. The other one which you mentioned, and it's super interesting, I've been recently reading about two fascinating humans, Elon Musk and the latest biography by Walter Isaacson. It's amazing. And there is a guy called Sam Zemure who established something called United Fruit. And both have one very interesting aspect in common. And you kind of mentioned it when you talked about how science is kind of taught and the papers and the publishing. They both come from a deeply scientific entrepreneurial bent, and they believe in being where the action is, which is so interesting. And like, you have to be where the action is. It's just like underwritten in everything that they do. And of course, one of my heroes that you just mentioned, and it just made me goosebumps, was David Suzuki. And the kind of work, if anybody is in the field of nature, you have to read David
Mhm.
Suzuki, because it's just so mind blowing. I have like stacks of his books just to give away. It's amazing that you worked with that and did the things, like got that community together and took them outdoors, because that's beautiful. And my last bit, because there was so much to learn when you were speaking, was when you talked about the science fiction of the maker and objects being made. There was a beautiful company that I interviewed, and if you haven't heard that interview, do hear it. You'll enjoy it. It's called UBQ from Israel, and you might want to connect
Mhm.
with them. They are taking things from the landfill and then creating polymers, and then so it's kind of what you saw in the maker side. But I'm going to start switching towards your work now. But just before we get into the regenerative waste labs, there's two fascinating areas where you've worked. Uh, you know, tell me more about the gray to green sustainable solutions. What attracted you to them, and what did you do there? And I love the idea of you being an alchemist and 7 leagues leather. And I couldn't understand it completely, but I would love for you to give your perspective on those two before we get into the meat and potatoes of this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Where does one start? I think, I guess it starts at the end. So the end of grad school, essentially. So I had so many great experiences during grad school, both good and bad. I think even the bad ones were great. And by the end, I was just tired. So I spent about 8 months being a barista at a local coffee shop, and that just allowed me to work very short hours, to be honest. I worked from about 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. I got almost unlimited day old baked goods, which was one of my favorite parts of working there. And then I had the afternoons to myself. I was also, I did a little stint at as a science edutainer, so I called Mad Scientist. So I'd go around to kids' birthday parties and after school programs and just kind of do crazy science acts for kids, which is really fun. And seeing the world through their eyes is always just fantastic. Um, and yeah, so I was there for about 8 months before I realized that I needed to maybe do a little bit something with the PhD I had just acquired. And so yeah, so I looked around at the world around me at that time, and I just couldn't find any companies that really resonated with me. I was very I was very centered on wanting to do something that was community centered, that was science centered, and that was aligned with my values. Like I wasn't really into going back into the academic system and becoming and going down that pathway. Just really wasn't aligned for me. But I didn't really see anything in that at that time in the space that I was in, so I decided to start my own thing, which is where Greater Green Sustainable Solutions came from. It was my first consulting company. I was just like, well, from what I've heard and learned, businesses want to transition to bio-based and compostable products, but they don't really seem to know how. So I thought maybe I could provide my services to give that educational component. And so yeah, so that's what I was doing for a little while. I was working with different companies, sharing with them different information about bio-based materials, helping them find the right products which might align with the right materials which might align with their products that they're developing. Around the same time, I was just kind of looking for different opportunities, and I met an amazing human named Tasha, who was the boss lady at 7 Leagues. So 7 Leagues is a circular economy business here in Vancouver. They're taking waste fish skins and using a bio-based tanning process to make fish leather. And so at that time, I was kind of like part-time doing my consulting and also looking for other opportunities. And I met Tasha. And so she was looking for somebody, a green chemist, which is what I was, to help her with her tanning process. And so I was just like, that sounds like a fun opportunity. And so yeah, so I started working with Tasha as her official alchemist to start developing her tanning process. And so through that process, she was working to set up relationships with different Indigenous bands so she could access the wood waste materials that she needed to make her tannins. We were also working with I believe it was a tanner out of Kenya, and we were working with him to understand his plant-based process so that we could emulate it here in Canada. There was differences because he was using things which are local to himself, but obviously that's more of a tropical climate, and you have different trees like papayas. So papayas actually have a natural digestive enzyme, which is great for the tanning process. But we were trying to find local alternatives for each of the different steps. And so I was helping Tasha identify different local plants which could be incorporated into the tanning process. And so, yeah, so we were working together. And for me, I was just really excited to work on any project which was to do with bio-based materials or plastics or things like that. That was my expertise and that was my interest. And my interest was also to help others. So I felt like, because I have worked in a research lab, so I've looked at the literature and I see there's just so many people working on these fantastic new biotechnologies. But for me, I was just like, well, how do we help that transition from the lab into the marketplace? Like, people need to know what these products are so they can actually use them. So that was really what I felt like my role was at that time, was really connecting the products that existed in the innovation landscape and then trying to connect those products with the people who could actually use them, because I wanted to see more bio-based materials be implemented so that we can start to do a greater transition away from conventional and fossil-based materials. So yeah, so those are kind of the two projects that allowed me to kind of continue to navigate the bio-based space in British Columbia, where I'm currently located. And then it was from there that we then took the next step into Regenerative Waste Labs. But I'll pause there in case there's any more questions.
It's good for humanity that you didn't decide to sit and publish papers.
It's true.
It's definitely good that your brain is looking at how to take things into the actual market, and of course that's a selfish agenda for me as well, because for um, what the work we do is all about, how do you leave the earth cleaner And the only way you can do it as it is at scale, when you create biomaterials at scale. And of course, I want to dig more and more into that. And there's so much I'm sure that you're going to bring into this conversation. So, but let's start with, how did Regenerative Waste Labs come about? And I know you call yourself the managing owner, and there are two more owners, Robert and Louis. And so how did it come about, and what was the objective that you guys were trying to tackle?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Waste Lab started with a conversation. Me being the person that I am, when I was thinking about transitioning away from the coffee shop, I thought, okay, how do I access this marketplace that I'm wanting to figure out how I can apply my skills into? So I sat down and I Googled plastics recycling Vancouver, and I think maybe about 10 or 13 different businesses popped up. I put together an email and I just sent that email to the info at for all of those companies. What ended up happening is only one person responded to me. But I was like, this is awesome. I've never actually been to a waste management facility. I'd love to come down for a tour. So they invited me down. I toured their facility and I met the owners, Rob and Louise, who were just amazing. Honestly, they were kind of everything I wanted to be. They had the values that I wanted. They were also, so Robert and Louise run a company called Recycling Alternative. They started the recycling program before the Blue Box program in Vancouver. So this was in the early 90s. So they were recycling before it was cool, essentially. And so throughout the last 20 years or so, or 30 years even of their careers, they have been innovating in different ways. They started a biofuel co-op. They've been working with community partners to co-locate with the local, the street economy, so people who are picking up cans and using those as their primary income source. So they were co-locating with different nonprofits. They were actively working to both, to innovate in the waste management space, as well as connect with their core community and make sure that all of the technologies and the solutions that they're putting out there have a economic and social impact. And that was my vibe, and it still is, to be honest. So when I met Rob and Louise, we were really kind of talking about the overlaps between our passions and our interests. And Robert is kind of the engineer of the duo. And so we were really interested in how my research could be applied to some of the waste management technology that he was developing. So we were working on a project which was centered around compostable products. And I was designing technologies to help do some testing with compostable products. And so we worked together for about a year and a half. But we were kind of going down this very long research pathway. And we started to recognize that research is expensive, and we need to find another mechanism to kind of fund this, so we can continue to do the innovation that we both wanted to do. So during that time, I was also working at Greater Green as my consulting firm, and I saw that I was starting to engage with businesses who were making bio-based materials and wanting to understand their environmental impact. I was doing this research project where I was actually designing technologies to do that type of testing. So it seemed like a good idea to kind of create this organization that could help businesses during their research and development stage do environmental performance testing, as well as continue to do our own internal research to drive kind of waste management innovation. And then also just have the mechanism to continue to educate and communicate and collaborate just through this all other entity. And that's really where the Waste Labs was born. And so we decided that it would make sense for us to kind of come together as a partnership and start to then to build the Waste Labs. But because Rob and Louise kind of have their fingers in many pies doing amazing work here in Vancouver, I was the one who was going to be kind of running the organization. And also because of my science background, it was kind of just an extension of my research and my expertise. And yeah, so that's where the Waste Labs was born. And so we have been building our core capacity. We have a research space in Vancouver. We're passionate about zero waste, essentially. So we've been building a zero waste lab. And so anyone who's kind of been in a research lab knows that it's shiny. There's lots of like shiny new equipment that you get from your research dollars from the government or whoever you might be getting your investments from. But for us, we're kind of doing it from a different way. So we wanted to make sure that we're centering our values of zero waste. So, and also, we're a startup, so we don't have the resources that a huge academic institution might have. So we were leveraging things like the secondary market for equipment. So we're looking at things even like Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, auction, the BC auctions websites. We're finding so much equipment through that stream, which was for cheap, and also we can just learn to refurbish things, like, you know, doing all the things that we want to do within the circular economy. And because Robert and Louise, they run a waste management organization, people are always calling them being like, oh, we have an office that we want to clear out, and all these different things. So we're able to get a lot of furniture and equipment for the lab just through that disposal stream as well, for pretty much for free as well. And then the third kind of way that we're building this lab is to build it ourselves. So when you look into the actual landscape for testing of compostable products, well, at least in North America, there's really only a handful of companies you can go to do testing. And because of that, there's not a very big marketplace for the equipment that you need to actually do this testing. And all that we saw at the time was a European company selling like a biodegradation respirometer for, I think it was upwards of 100,000 euros. And I was like, I'm not going to be able to afford that. But so what I ended up doing was looking into the literature. And there's quite a lot of, there's a few designs of respirometers and biodegradation equipment in the literature. So I worked with a few university interns to build this equipment ourselves. And so that was what we were able to use to be able to facilitate some of the work that we were doing as well. So it was really just like, kind of that entrepreneurial spirit, just figuring out how we can use the things around us to get the work done. And so we really wanted to embed those values, at least from the ground up, and obviously as we continue to grow, we'll be able to transition to a more established research space. But at the moment, it's really just about how can we showcase that you don't have to necessarily be super shiny and you know, getting the big research dollars to actually be able to facilitate good science. And so we wanted to make sure that we're showing people that it is possible to do good science in a community kind of centered perspective, where you can bring people in, you can give people tours of that space. You can, we've also done kind of work where we're at community sites to do different composting trials and things like that. So really, how can we bring the community into the work that we're doing and share and showcase the results that we're seeing as well, especially in the realm of compostables and bio-based materials. Like, we need to be communicating more about the pros and cons, the challenges and opportunities that we have to overcome to be able to fully facilitate this. So the Waste Labs, we're really centering ourselves on a cleaner and healthier world. It's a real challenge, I think, sometimes, that when we think about circular economy, we're kind of thinking only about material flows and not necessarily the impact on human and environmental health. So we're really trying to center the fact that bio-based is intended to lead to cleaner and healthier products for our planet. We're also about collaboration. So we're really wanting to work with businesses throughout their research and development phase so that we can help them improve the products that they're creating. And we're about leadership. It's really, how can we kind of exemplify the values that we want to show, that we want the industry to show, and how can we bring people along that journey with us as well?
I've never heard of a lab being MacGyvered. That's amazing. It takes courage to create a biodegradation machine, but it actually took me back to, we have some crazy scientists as well, and we had to test water vapor transmission rate, WVTR, and that was an expensive equipment, similar, maybe higher price than 100,000 euros. And these guys just created it. It just took a little longer, but I was like, what? How do you do that? I said, we can do it in like 2,000 euros. Can you give us that much? We were like, yeah. And it was amazing. But yeah, we just bought this biodegradation unit, so we know what it costs.
Yes, there you go.
It's amazing. We should have contacted you before. Can you create one more, two of them instead of
But yeah, because
one?
we wanted to make open source kind of designs as well to allow both people in the in emerging economies to be able to access these tests as well, because it's really inaccessible to them. If we want more people to transition, we need to make sure that these technologies are accessible to everybody, and that's what we're really trying to showcase too. But yeah, it's definitely not the traditional way to go about things. But in my mind, I figure, like, I continue to go back to the early days. Like, there has been times when science has been done without all the shiny things. It does take longer. It may require more hands-on management, but it can be done. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not as good or as robust as these big shiny machines that we're creating. I think it's really important to continue to make sure that we have that connection to the work that we're doing and that we can showcase from the ground up how those processes are working. So I try not to, I mean, it's always good to be able to purchase things and make things easier for ourselves, but I think it's important to maintain this idea of being connected to the work that we do as well.
I couldn't agree more with you because it's such a the whole certification and testing is a business, and what I find is that it's difficult even for a materials company like the one we run. It's very difficult because all these places, it's the same test. The ISO number is the same,
Hmm.
13042, whatever, and but if you go into the United States, you'll need a different certificate. If you
Yeah.
go into Europe, and then if you go Australia, if you go India, and it's the same freaking test. So why don't you guys just talk to each other? But of
Yeah.
course, that's their way of earning, but it's expensive. So just to get a certificate, it's upwards of $10,000, and that's
Hmm.
not, and to keep it renewed every year. And yeah, so I totally get what you're saying, but yeah, I hope that that part of the world also changes. What I see in the Regenerative Waste Labs, what I hear from you and then read is there seem to be three broad parts: the science of compost, which is, I guess, where your co-owners come in, uh, and biomaterials and organic waste recovery. And these are the three, apart from the testing services, of course, for these ideas. What I want to delve into a little more, are you guys already thinking about creating biomaterials yourselves or working with companies that are trying to build biomaterials? I saw our common friend Earthos Nuha being mentioned on your website. It's always a joy to see her. So is there things that you guys are doing in order to create new biomaterials as well?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is no. So then the reason for that is that we take a waste-based perspective in the work that we do. So we're always coming from it from the end of life rather than from the beginning of life. Because at the moment, the way our structure, our systems are set up, it's linear, right? And it starts at the beginning of life, it moves towards the end of life. We want to start to turn that line into a circle. We have to prioritize and emphasize what that waste management at that end of life piece is. And so we think of it as designing backwards. So it's like if we start at the end, what steps do we need to actually get to the beginning again? So for us, that's the perspective that we bring. We're also, so the Waste Labs ourselves, we are a research consulting firm, which means that we're supporting other people to actualize and implement their innovations more effectively. And so the technology that we're developing is in collaboration with with my business partner's other company, Terraformer Systems. So they're developing organic recovery technologies for compostable products, organic waste, and other, organic waste streams as a whole. And so a lot of the work that we do gets translated into new technologies through that organization. And so we love working with people. We have a core expertise, as you've mentioned, of compost science and biomaterials and organic recovery. So how can we use the equipment, the research, and our expertise to support businesses to reach their goals? Because for us, we see ourselves as, I guess, the tide which raises all boats. So if more people have access to this infrastructure to actually develop and ensure products are safe and healthy for people on the planet, that means we can see more of those products into our marketplace more quickly than just us kind of creating another biomaterial into that space. And that just is kind of from my core values of being a service. I really do believe that service is a service. Science is a service, and that we are, it's important for scientists to recognize that we are obligated to translate our knowledge and our research into things that can be implemented into our communities. And so, yes, we work with businesses. So we've worked with a lot of different startups across North America to help them. We either design kind of experiments to help them take a deep dive into certain aspects of their environmental performance or environmental impact. So looking at things like chemicals of concern, so we can think about PFAs and the other challenging chemicals, especially if you're thinking about entering global marketplaces, trying to get into the EU these days. You need to have you have to be very clear about what chemicals are inside of your products. We're also looking at impacts on plant and soil health, as well as how products are actually breaking down within composting environments. There's a lot that goes into composting, but for the sake of this conversation, we'll just leave it at that for now. And then the other kind of side of that coin is supporting organizations that are generating organic waste and helping them find opportunities to add value to that waste. So we see it as two sides of the waste management coin. One, how products can enter waste and circular waste systems, as well as how organic waste can be fed into the products that can then be fed into those circular waste systems. So we're trying to support both of those sides so that we can start to really kickstart the engine of the circular bioeconomy here in Canada. And yeah, it's so interesting because there's so much waste and there's so many products that you can make from that waste. It's really just about how can we make sure that there's the connection between those. And so we see ourselves as really building that network of organizations across Canada and facilitating the transfer of knowledge and materials around this particular ecosystem.
That's fascinating. I'm going to delve into just a term that you mentioned in passing, and I've always been intrigued by PFAs. And it's very intriguing for me, especially, and we had a lovely conversation with the head of BPI on the podcast. And again, that was a fascinating angle that he brought in. But when I look at the whole furor, especially in North America around PFAS, it's very interesting for me because if you look at molded fiber products, which are easy to break down, but there is an oil proofing chemical that just has traces of PFAS, but it has become this huge furor. And I was thinking, I'm from a science perspective, how bad is it really? You know, because you look at the soil. So if a molded fiber container was to actually biodegrade in a soil, and it may or may not have traces of the PFAS. So from a science perspective, how do you see it? And is there reality to it, or is it more drama? How do you see that? Also, because I'm told, just the water we drink has PFAS.
Yeah.
So what is the reality? I'd love to get your thoughts and ideas on that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And it really comes down to the mechanisms we have in place to prevent both the use and the contamination that comes from environmental contaminants at the end of the day. So I think the challenge is that the way that we're currently quantifying the impact of different types of environmental contaminants really comes down to exposure. So at the moment, we're assuming that, for example, this molded fiber container there's only one of them either touching our bodies or entering the environment. But it's really important for us to recognize and remember that it's not just one thing. Like, we ourselves as humans are being exposed to like different types of contaminants through almost every single product that we interact with every day. Each of those individual products is potentially not toxic, but what is the impact of all of those products accumulating every day in our system for 20 plus years? That's the kind of assessment that we don't currently have when we're looking at the environmental safety of different products that we're using. So it's a challenging conversation because at the moment we're not talking about the thing that's actually the most important thing to talk about. As you've mentioned, if we're getting PFAS in our drinking water, as well as the containers that we use, as well as the cooking equipment that we're using, that's multiple routes for these chemicals into our bodies and into our ecosystems. And what is the impact of that cumulative effect? We haven't really understood that. And I think that's really what the concern from the environmental perspective is that it may not be effectively being communicated that way, but that is what the overarching issue is. It's like, if everybody is using these, even in minute amounts, what is the long-term accumulation? And since we know that PFAs are termed to be forever chemicals, they're just accumulating more and more and more as we continue to use these small amounts over and over again. So we don't actually know the impacts. It's kind of like how we didn't know the impacts of CFCs on our ozone layer until 20 or 30. Well, we can talk about the conspiracies, but until about 20 or 30 years after that, they've actually been deployed. So, and that's really where I think the challenge really is. And I think that we don't necessarily have robust enough systems to be quantifying and enforcing these the reduction of use of certain things as well. I think we can. There's probably an entire hour we could talk about whether or not some of these systems are actually robust enough to be protecting us, and that's kind of a whole other thing. But I think it's just the fact that we really need to conceptualize that there's already been so many stories about environmental contaminants in the products that we use every day that businesses may or may not have known about, but they eventually did know about and didn't do anything about. And so, but how can we actually mitigate that? And I think the benefit of compostables, which I think is often lost in the conversation, is that they are inherently tested to be non-toxic. You do a heavy metal test, you do plant and soil health tests, you also do PFA tests now, which is challenging in the way that they're doing tests within the certification schemes, but that's another conversation as well. But there's so many kind of markers to ensure that the products that do get that stamp of approval are seen to be non-toxic from the perspectives that we currently know. There's always more things which could come up that may lead to more toxicity, but there's certified compostable products are tested to be non-toxic, and that, in my mind, makes them so much more beneficial than other products which don't have to go through that rigorous testing. And I think that needs to be brought to the forefront. I think it's human and environmental safety needs to be of key concern, especially in this landscape where we're seeing so many contaminants being reported about after such a long amount of time of them being in products that we use every day.
So more direct question, just because of my, just the interest in the subject itself. So if there were three alternates, there was a rigid plastic container, there was a styrofoam or polystyrene container, and there was a molded fiber container that still had the traces, that was still using the oil proofing chemical, and all three had hot food in it. Which one would you use, or which one would you recommend that people use?
What type of plastic container was it?
It's just a rigid plastic, a polyethylene, or some kind of a high density polyethylene container, or a PP, could be polypropylene.
Yeah, that's a great question.
One of those.
It's kind of choosing the best of all the evils, to be honest. Because for the rigid plastic container, you just don't know what's inside of it at all. There's no way to know, even if it's not PFAs, is there something else that's inside of that container? Polystyrene, if you're putting hot food in polystyrene, you're getting styrene into your system, which is a known carcinogen. So that's already a no-no, and there's so many things about polystyrene we should be doing. But then once again, with the molded fiber PFAs, I don't know off the top of my head, I'm not sure if they are absorbed at higher temperature versus low temperature. But once again, you're still at risk. So from a toxicity perspective, they're equally all as bad as each other. It's only when we add that other layer of end of life and then also beginning of life on top of that, then we can start to actually make some real, informative choices. That's another kind of challenge that I see, is that we can't really just use one lens to say whether or not a product is good or bad. We have to look at things from multiple perspectives to get that fuller story. But yeah, from a toxicity standpoint, I couldn't recommend any of them because they're all kind of problematic in their own way. So if you're choosing which one is best, you're not choosing which one's best, you're just choosing something. And that's fine.
You're right. So I read an amazing book. I'm hoping that you've gone through it. It's called Sicker, Fatter, Poorer.
No, I haven't. That's fascinating.
Oh, you love it because it's all about what you were talking about. It's all about the kind of things that we are putting into our system and what it's doing to us. And it's particularly focused on the American diet and the GM and things we don't know about, and even on the pesticides and the diabetes and the cancer and obviously obesity. That are all getting built into the system. And it even talks about, the mental health issues and autism and how all that is connected. And we are not realizing that. So it was fascinating when you were talking about these ideas, that book was coming to my mind. So I thought I'll mention it, and you'll love that one. So one thing I wanted to pick your brains on, just as I was actually reading more about the work you do, was on the side of green chemistry. And you clearly seem to be a proponent of that. And sometimes what I find is that we can create interesting materials, but we don't talk enough about the process. And we
Mm-hmm.
may be using a very harsh chemical, a solvent in the process. For example, if I look at the pulping process, you're using either a sulfate or a soda process, and that's extremely corrosive.
Mm-hmm.
And or you're using some kind of a chloride to bleach. Um, and I feel when I look at nature around, there's every the solvent is water in the end,
Yes.
and then it's all green chemistry, and we can come out with a great product, and then we just hide behind that, what is the process, how much water, how much, and of course you can go to a life cycle analysis, but still lots is lost in that. How do you see that from a green chemist lens? And are there things that you are keen on, excited about in terms of utilizing a better process to manufacture things at scale? Because that's the
Mm-hmm.
other challenge, right?
Yeah.
Nature sometimes doesn't manufacture quickly at scale. So how would you look at that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I mean, green chemistry is one of my passions, really. I think there's 12 principles of green chemistry. Please don't ask me to recite them all. But the intention
I'm
around
aware of them, but then definitely the listeners, it's very simple and straightforward and clear. So I would definitely encourage listeners to just Google the 12 principles of green chemistry, and
definitely.
water, of course, being the primary one.
Because I think at the end of the day, it's really about yeah, making sure the way that we're creating the products and materials we use every day is not more. It's not adding more impact to those products and materials. Um, the importance of green chemistry, I think, as with everything, often sustainability gets tacked on as its own thing that you need to learn about. But the intention around green chemistry is the recognition that greenness and sustainability should be incorporated into every aspect of the work that we do. Um, and so green chemistry gives us the tools to be able to do that. It gives us the tools to be able to decide between chemical pathways or chemical syntheses to determine, based on what our core values are or what our requirements are for that process, we can choose which one is going to be quote unquote greener than the other. And there's always compromises to be made, but I think the importance of having the tools to be able to quantify those is that we can know where we are, know where we're going for our first step, and know how we can start to improve. And so that's really what green chemistry provides. And so one of the key things for the work that I do, I guess, is this idea of atom economy. So you're starting with 17 different atoms or molecules. You're doing a transformation of some sort. How much of that is going to go into your product and how much of that is considered to be waste? And is there something that you can do in your process to facilitate more of that being product and less of that being waste? And that idea of atom economy can be extrapolated to this being the idea of the circular economy as a whole. So how much of that waste that we're transforming can be used into a new product, and how much of that is just going to end up as waste, quote unquote. And that could be waste solids, liquids, or gases. So often the waste that is being proponent, the focus of most of the waste that we are worried about today is gaseous emissions, so carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. But that may not be capturing all of the waste that a process may be emitting in one way or another. And so, yeah, so that's really what led me to, that's where I apply green chemistry in the work that I do. It's probably the most obvious. Some of the things around green chemistry that people are doing, as you've mentioned, water is a great solvent, but water is also one of the hardest things to remove from your system as well. And so there's lots of new types of solvents, which are bio-based solvents, so things like limonene that you can extract from citrus. So how can we extract those building blocks from nature to be able to use those? There's also new types of solvents, like one of the ones is supercritical CO2. So when you when you change the temperature and pressure, so carbon dioxide becomes like this kind of fluxy, nebulous thing, which isn't really a gas or a liquid, that you can use to actually, I think that's what they use to extract the caffeine from coffee beans. There's also ionic liquids. So in water, you have the water molecule forming, as I mentioned, these connections with other water molecules. In ionic liquids, we've manufactured and designed these molecules which are held together to form this really interesting water-like material. But how we make those ionic liquids is a whole other question as well. So, and what came to mind actually was the pulping process when you mentioned green chemistry, because yeah, when I was doing my PhD, I was looking at lignin, which is extracted from wood pulp, essentially. And they do that through those two different methods, soda and sulfate. And one of the aspects of my work was to look into green versions of that, using different types of solvents, which were able to reduce the pressure and the temperature of those extractions. So it may also just be looking at how do I get to this product in a greener and cleaner way. But I think the real challenge really comes down to the fact that we need to, like, as I mentioned before, it's like taking a holistic look. So the 12 principles gives us 12 different things we can look at in our reaction to see if we can improve upon it. And so if we can look at things from different perspectives, make changes in one, that's great. And we can start to move down the list, and we can move into different sections. It just gives us a framework for improving, a framework for measuring, and a framework for improving.
Yeah, and I like the idea of that you don't have to do a complete shift. You can at least start improving. And of course, we worked at one point, and again, nature inspired with enzymes and white rot mushrooms and, things that actually, work in that domain of removing lignin. And but I also think sometimes that why are we removing lignin? And that's another conversation for another day, I think, because the idea again is, like when I look at nature, it's creating these cellulosic or sugar chains just by sequestering carbon through
Mm-hmm.
photosynthesis and some minerals, and then using solar energy. And you get these crazy, amazing trees, right? Like the where you are, the black spruces and the white spruces, and like this beautiful. And then, of course, it's bound by lignin, and we try and unbind it and then kind of bind it. But yeah, that's more of my utopian brain and thinking that how do you not do that? How don't you don't need to squish everything, and how could it be additive instead of subtractive?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, but I think that'll take a whole other conversation. But what I wanted to jump into, and you actually inferred on it, was the idea, because you're looking so much at the waste streams. We give out very random numbers. So you would give out a number like, oh, that's a basic plastic bag. It'll take 500 years to break down. The first guy was created, whatever, 70, 80 years back. So, who knows that? And how does one assume that? The other one, which I'm obsessed with, is the flexible packaging domain with multi-layered, metallized films. And that they say is 100,000 years. And of course, I use these figures all the time in my communication with zero knowledge of them. So from a scientist's perspective, what is it really? Because ultimately, it is coming from a biomaterial, but of course, it's been heavily engineered. But is there really a timeline that people can assess, or this is just a guesswork? And because you're seeing things break down and you're working on that, how do you see that whole breaking down of different polymer, petroleum-based polymer materials? How are you seeing that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting one for sure. Yeah, the work that we do, we see how things kind of break down within composting environments, and definitely looking at the literature on how all of that works as well. I think one of the biggest challenges with conventional plastics is that they're fully synthetic, in the sense that nature hasn't designed anything to be a pure carbon chain to be the length that they have. Like some of these, I think they're millions of units long for a polyethylene, especially a flexible film one. And really, it's just we do now. I think the ones like the natural systems, as you mentioned, is like the white rot fungi, which does break down long carbon chains, and it's supposed to break down lignin, which does have an oxygen in its core, but it does that through a peroxide sort of degradation mechanism. So the real challenge is, how do things break down in nature? And I think that's one of the biggest things that people don't fully conceptualize or understand. And so, yeah, when the way that we communicate degradation is that it happens in 3 concurrent steps, but we can think about them separately. One is physical degradation, where we can imagine when we eat food, our teeth grind that food up into small pieces. Similarly, when we're thinking about how plastics kind of break down if they're littered, like if you have a plastic bottle that someone threw out the window, it could be degraded by a car driving over it. It could be like degraded just by being knocked around or rubbed against different things to form those small pieces. The next step is chemical degradation. So you can think of the food moving into your stomach, the acids and things start to break it apart, like the actual chemical structure breaks down. So you have the breaking down often between a carbon and an oxygen, or a carbon and a nitrogen within a chemical molecule. Those are the weakest links to actually break things apart, and the easiest way to break things apart as well. So if we once again then look at the chemical degradation of conventional plastics in our environment, that is the step which takes the longest amount of time, because there's no oxygen or water, there's nothing to actually attack, quote unquote, that chain, because there's no natural systems that really know how to break it down. The way that those chains are broken apart is through high energy transformations. And so that could be things like heat. Often heat creates single electrons, which are able to kind of get in there and cause issues, essentially. And so anything which generates a single electron, so that could be heat, it could be things like electricity and lightning, and it could be things chemically done through things called peroxides. So peroxides just have lone electrons that are able to once again get in and make problems. So when we're looking at how conventional plastics break down, it's the chemical degradation that is required for that plastic to actually start to become accumulated into biological systems. And that's the piece which takes the most amount of time, and I guess the most amount of guesswork as well. I'll just quickly talk about the biological degradation before I go back to the chemical one and how some of these numbers come about. But once we have small molecules in our stomach, they've been broken apart chemically, it's now those small molecules that can start to move into our intestines and be absorbed by our natural systems, because they're no longer long, bulky chains of things. They're small, they can go in between and be absorbed by the different chemical things within our body to actually absorb those nutrients. In biological systems, the action of electrons and things like that have converted those long polymer chains into things which have oxygens or nitrogens at the end. And now that there's some sort of natural group that's attached to our synthetic group, it can start being recognized by nature and be taken up by microbes and other types of biological systems. And so, as I mentioned, all of those things happen concurrently. Like you can imagine a bottle gets thrown out the window, it gets ground by a car, and that chips off microplastics. And those microplastics are now able to start to undergo a little bit more chemical degradation more readily. Whereas you still have a big bottle that's still there, that still needs to slowly degrade over time. So when we look at how some of these numbers have been calculated, they've done things like weathering tests. So you could put your product inside of a chamber that gives it very specific conditions. So it's like we can imagine 100 years worth of weathering, because we've just blasted it with sand and we've raised and we've kind of cycled the temperature up a bunch of times, and we've started to strain that material. So it's these types of tests that can be done for relatively short time periods, but then those results get extrapolated. But as we know with any model, because it's just a model that we're placing on top of the real world, it's a model. So we don't necessarily know how the complex dynamics of these 3 interweaving degradation pathways are actually interacting, but we can make some assumptions and start to extrapolate that further. But the extrapolation is really just a guesstimate. But we do know, based on our knowledge of weathering, the polymer chains themselves, and the likelihood of products ending up in these different environments for different lengths of time, we can make an educated guess. But I think saying it's an educated guess is challenging for the layperson, because they just hear that word guess. But there is technical knowledge and expertise behind that guess. But We can't know. I mean, we may put a bottle in an environment, like it may happen to be next to an old volcano, and then that bottle can degrade quite quickly, right? But we have to talk in generalizations, and we have to talk about this extrapolation piece, and that's just kind of where those broad numbers come about. When we're looking at compostable products, they have the oxygen and nitrogen built into the chain, which means that natural systems can pick them up and start to break them down much more quickly and more readily than these petroleum synthetically based. I use synthetic probably in the wrong term, in the wrong definition here, but I mean human-made. And so, so conventional plastics are different because they have different chemistry in their chains, but compostable plastics and bio-based materials which have been extracted from natural systems and not been converted too much chemically, they have those building blocks which nature can pick up on and start to break down itself, which does speed it up. But we've seen things like polylactic acid and other types of other studies saying they still take 100 years in the ocean, for example, and that makes sense because you don't necessarily have the temperature or the microbes that are going to be doing and facilitating that breakdown. We may be relying more on physical degradation or chemical degradation than the biological one. So it's all about where that product ends up and where on this which of these three different degradation processes are being utilized at any time point, depending on that product. So I guess that's very technical and hand-wavy, but that's where it really comes from.
You're definitely a great teacher, Love-Ese. I can keep listening to you, and there's so many nuggets to take away. I loved your clarification, human-made, because of course there's so many inorganics in nature as well,
Exactly.
and sometimes we don't realize that there's so many synthetics that are nature made, and and we don't think about that as well. And taking this conversation a little bit further, because you mentioned lactic acids. So what is your take on this domain of home composting and industrial composting? Of course, mainly coming out of the PLA kind of domain, and I'm also told that sometimes PLAs, and you talked about marine ecology, may leave behind microparticles. What is how would you want the ideal situation to kind of evolve? What would that be?
Yeah, so I think the debate between, I'm not sure if it really is a debate, but the question or the conversation around home compostable, quote unquote, versus industrial combustible versus other types of waste streams, I think it really comes from the fact that we need more access to organic recovery in one way or another. So it either can be done at home or it can be done through centralized collection. But it needs to be done. And so trying to design a product when you don't really have a clear understanding of where that product could potentially go means that you have to try to design for as many end-of-life pathways as possible, which is a real challenge for the person who's innovating, because that type of uncertainty leads to, one, a challenge in actually designing a product, two, it opens you up to risk from compliance changes and things like that, and three, it opens you up to risk from just not, from the public or your customer not really understanding the reasons why you can't be very specific about where that product can go. And so I think once we get into this space of wanting to understand the end of life for products, we quickly have to recognize that everything is part of an interconnected network of human behavior and human activity. So we can't just design a product and say, this product will be home compostable, because we cannot be sure that that product will actually end up in somebody's home or even in someone's home compost. So it's very similar to like this, the challenge that we have in guesstimating how long a product will actually take to break down. Like, there's so many unknowns to that system that it has to be an educated guess. And similarly, when we're designing a product for a specific end of life, we can do as much as we can to design that product for home composting or industrial composting, and I can talk about the difference in just a moment. But we have to, at a certain point, just have, we need to take an educated guess as to where that product will actually end up based on what we know about the system as a whole. And I think That's the real challenge. And I think at the moment, we have this drive in North America to expand industrial centralized composting facilities to facilitate more compostable products entering the market. We also see people saying, okay, well, maybe there's technologies that we can implement in people's homes, like benchtop composters, that will help to facilitate that process as well. And we also have people saying, okay, we can train people to do home composting to once again facilitate that process. There's lots of mechanisms in the marketplace today to try to increase the access to organics recovery, but the important thing to recognize is that it's still a transient space. It's still a work in progress, right? But at the same time, while we're working on the end of life, does that mean we have to stop working on the beginning of life or building that infrastructure, that supply chain? It's unfortunate that things have to happen concurrently, otherwise the whole system won't actually be able to function effectively. But in this time of transition and creation, how do we communicate to all the different stakeholders that this is what's happening, this is our collective goal, and we're at the point where we're just taking steps along the pathway until we get to that realized world that we want to actually have. And that's a real challenge, and I don't think the marketplace has fully figured out how to approach that conversation in a way that's going to bring people in and not just kind of create more gaps and barriers for people to access that space. But I have seen products that work in all of those environments. I've seen products work across the board. And one of my frustrations, I guess, is when I see regulation and policy coming into play, which just doesn't really acknowledge the fact that there are products that fit very well into each of these end-of-life buckets. And the real challenge is that, one, they don't have the large enough market share for more people to use because they are like companies that are just starting up and wanting to scale and actually be able to provide their solution into the broader marketplace. It's so expensive to make a good bio-based material, and that's one of the most significant challenges, I believe. And just the fact that we're still arguing about whether or not it's worthwhile to build this infrastructure. But we know that if the infrastructure is there, that there will be products that will be able to fit into it. So it's just, how can we start to move from should we do it to really how do we do it and how do we communicate it effectively?
So taking a cue from that, there's a couple of things that, and you talked about systems thinking, and I won't get too much into it, but just to mention again, ultimately, the challenge also is one more link to the chain, which is like, where does the compost go? And that
Yes.
gets into land use, like what are we putting into our soil and how are we degrading the soil, etc. And where is the market for compost? Because that's the other piece of the puzzle that needs to be tackled. One of the things that you mentioned right in the beginning, also from your co-owners, and this is something that I have continued to struggle with, the ideas around recycling slash downcycling slash upcycling. And at least in generic terms, when we use recycling, I find it's more downcycling, and then there is a moment in time when it cannot be downcycled anymore, and nobody knows when that is. And of course, a lot of it doesn't get into its 6 or 7% is the max
Yeah.
kind of amount that is being downcycled or recycled. How do you see that, the downcycling, recycling equation, and what would your hope be in that system?
hmm Yeah, just to touch on the where the compost goes question, I think that's a fantastic one. And I think we need to think more broadly about where compost can support the regeneration and rejuvenation of our natural environment and outside of just agriculture, because there's so much we can do with this organic material. But on the recycling front, I think it's important to recognize and notice that recycling was not designed to work well. It was designed as a scapegoat, or it was designed as action that these businesses could take to mitigate the growing understanding that this plastic has been generated and not actually going anywhere or doing anything. I think there's an idea that our plastics recycling systems are like optimized for efficiency right now, and they certainly are not. They've really been tacked on to our just out into our waste systems. You know, we designed our waste systems to take waste from people's homes to somewhere else, which no one had to deal with anymore, which was a landfill. We didn't design our waste systems to make sure that materials were actually being reused and within a small location for the benefit of that community. And so there's a lot that we can do to be actually design systems more effectively in that way. It's just whether or not that's kind of the growing desire of the different entities within this marketplace. As to the world I would love to be able to see when it comes to recycling, it's multifold. So I guess at the moment, for those who may or may not have taken a tour of a recycling facility, what ends up happening is that you're collecting waste from a diversity of businesses and homes, sometimes separately, sometimes it all gets piled in together. It ends up coming to a facility where it gets sorted between like plastics different types of plastics, aluminum, paper, etc. It kind of all gets separated out. But what you ended up with is just kind of a mix of bottles and cans and things, and you don't know what's inside of them. You don't really know what's going on. So you're pretty much picking up a dirty mixture and trying to get the most value out of that dirty mixture as you kind of take it throughout that supply chain. But it's really about how can we rethink the way that process is even done to reduce the amount of, to improve the atom economy of that whole process, right? So if we now start to think about recycling as a chemical equation, can we change the way that we're doing source separation at the beginning? Can we change the way that we're transporting or we're collecting that material? Can we change the way that we're washing, processing that material? And can we change the products that we create from that material? So there's multiple different places within that equation that we can start to think about improving or changing or just recognizing if there are limits to what we can do. And it really takes I think you kind of touch on this idea of holistic or systems thinking, which is where it gets complicated, I think, because everything we've done up to this point has been very linear and binary and truncated. So I might take us on a little bit of a tour of my science before I get back to this question. But the way that the stories within our modern societies, especially in the West, they're centered around these ideas of science, and science being the best way for us to quantify, understand, and then utilize the information that we've created for ourselves on this planet. So we look at a system, we separate the different players within that system. There is the leaves, the trees, there's the water, there's the animals. We're separating all those things. We're then looking at the trees themselves. Like, how do trees work? How does the water work? How do the animals work? We're looking at each of those systems separately to be able to try to get an understanding of how the whole thing works together. But you're losing information every time you're just focusing on one thing. So when we're moving from this linear and binary and kind of abstracted, broken apart way of seeing the world to something that's more systems thinking, non-binary, continuum, collaborative, collective kind of way of seeing the world, it means we have to give up the ease of isolated systems and start to look into the chaos of these very big and interconnected systems. But we don't really have the language or the stories to actually do that at the moment, and that's what people are trying to develop. We're trying to develop the language that we need to communicate how to design big and bulky and truncated and these very complex systems. And one of the best things that I've seen recently on how to describe these interactions has come from the allegory of a game. So we're all pretty well versed at games. We have players, we have moves, we have outcomes, we have rules, and we have little tokens that we can move around and we can trade between these different players. So if we sit down and think about this recycling or the circular economy as a game, that we have rules, so we can collectively decide on what these rules are. We can also collectively decide on what outcomes we want from this game. We have players, we have businesses like mine who are service-based, we have businesses like yours which are developing products, We have the businesses who are transporting and moving these materials around. Each of those players has specific moves that they can make. My business can innovate in technologies for testing, for example. Policymakers can create new incentives and barriers or different rules for the game. We can come together as a collaboration and create a new way of doing moves. We can, create a cooperative that is going to take all of this waste from a farm and then sell that into a commodity marketplace, for example. There's lots of different moves that we can make. And there's outcomes to those moves as well. I can make money. I can have more staff on my team. I can expand my business. I can expand into new marketplaces. There's lots of different outcomes. But there's also impacts, right? So my impact is I built a facility in a small town, and now that entire town is kind of beholden on my facility. So if my facility closes down, then that will mean this entire community is kind of out of a job. And that could be a positive, but it also means that that community has lost some of its resilience to change as well. And that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, it needs to be something that's recognized and understood by all of the players inside of that space. So there's so much that can be done, and I'm already kind of explaining all of these different things we can do within this game of the circular economy, but it's a way of recognizing that there's specific interactions between all of these different aspects to our game, and we need to really just be able to consider those as we navigate this changing landscape. And so I haven't talked about recycling at all, but but I think the problem
you have
is...
and you have not. But you have, in the sense that the way you're putting it is again in the systems thinking, and I love your idea of a game. But please carry on.
Oh yes, I mean, really, what I'm trying to get down to is that we just collectively know that recycling is good, and that by improving the way that we do recycling, we can make sure that we're increasing the value of the materials that we use every day. But as I've mentioned, to be able to improve the value of the materials we use every day, there's lots of aspects to that system which need to change. But we can't just change it individually. We have to find a way to change that collectively. But to be able to actually navigate and understand the impacts of those changes, we need to just have a better framework to assess, quantify, and know how to improve on those systems. But we have to do that collaboratively, because we know from our history that only looking at things in truncated silos will not lead to the overarching results that we want to see.
And I love your idea of a game and thinking of it like like that puzzle and everything coming together. A clarifying question: you just mentioned you have to think compost beyond agriculture. Mm-hmm. What are other uses? What would you say is another?
That's a great question. I haven't seen too many other uses actually being implemented. Let me take a step back. So other uses that have been known to be used is, for example, you have a city which does composting. They're using that compost to add plants to the side of the road. So they put the compost down and they put plants there. So just for general use around your city, not necessarily for high quality production of agricultural products. I also would love to see more research into the use of compost from municipal facilities in places which have been devastated either through droughts, through fires, through floods washing away the surface layer of the soils. How can we use this organic material to rebuild those soil ecosystems? There's obviously need, and there's so much plastic in our compost from conventional plastics, not from compostable plastics, that needs to be addressed in itself. If we want to be putting that material into potentially damaged ecosystems, if that's going to be impactful. But for me, it's if I don't see research into it, then I don't see why there's a bad thing. I see there's a gap that we need to understand whether or not it's possible. I think often if there's not research, people are well, it means that it's not going to be good. But that's not the conclusion that you should be getting from the fact that there's no research. It means that we need to do the research to know what the impact will be. And so I really do believe that we have enough devastated ecosystems that we can put compost into them to improve and to actually start to give us a good market driver as well. And that may simply mean that we have to invest in technologies which will extract more of the conventional plastics out of our compost so that we can use it. And I think that's still a fine thing to do as well.
Yeah, that's true. And again, it takes us to the idea of again, how does one decide that? Because we continue to degrade our ecosystems as we go along anyway. So, so
Yes.
who is going to catch up is the question. I read this beautiful some words from you, which were beautiful for me as I was doing my reading. And I'm going to read it out to you verbatim and this is from your LinkedIn, so it's pretty open. But I like that idea that you put across, and then that'll take me towards the sort of the end of our conversation today, and it'll lead well. My interests, you say, my interests lie at the intersection of the circular economy, bioeconomy, green chemistry, and sustainable science. I have taken my scientific training into industry and I'm passionate about communicating and translating my knowledge into new ventures and initiatives that will add value to our communities. And this is where it was leading to communities. And that's why I wanted to read this. And it's just such a beautiful quote encapsulating the ideas that you're trying to bring across. And that takes me to this idea of Lice Institute Network for Africa. What are you doing there, and how does that come in on your focus on giving back and getting involved with the community?
Yeah, that's yeah. The Lewis Network for Africa was a student-led organization out of the University of British Columbia. I randomly found out a bit about it, like an email coming into my inbox. But it was intended to really bring together the community of researchers who are from Africa or doing research about Africa or for Africa. And so I was so excited to join that. As I mentioned, I didn't spend much time in Nigeria growing up, and being a person from New Zealand, there weren't that many Nigerians there. So I was kind of starved for community myself, and so interestingly enough, many of the steering committee were Nigerians, so very entrepreneurial humans, especially those traveling to different countries to kind of pursue higher education. But yeah, so that was kind of my first time where I was able to sit down with other Black scientists and researchers to really talk about issues pertaining to our, I guess our collective homeland, which is Africa. Both celebrating the successes of things which have been just a little bit overlooked by the West, but just amazing research and what's I'm looking for? Initiatives that have been started on the continent to really drive community-centered action, which I felt like was just amazing, but also to translate the knowledge and learning that we had from here in North America and other places around the world to the African context as well. And so really it was just this place where we wanted to center ideas of learning and sharing, and recognition that yes, there has been significant historical impacts into the way that Africa has entered the global stage of the last 60 to 70 years, which has been very impactful for many people. But we are a continent of deep thinkers and community-centered individuals who want to find ways to use those values to really kind of translate not just Africa but the world. And so it's just an amazing opportunity to learn from people across diverse from academic disciplines across the world to really just be coming together for this one core purpose of finding new ways forward. So yeah, it was fantastic to be part of the steering committee for that organization.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and I love your, the whole um, thought of finding ways to connect and give back. And I would not be doing justice if we were to finish this conversation without talking about your love for creative writing. So I want to
Yes.
pivot, and I want you to at least tell us about, and I read some of your work, and it was beautiful, and it was also when you write about science creatively, because that's also really important. And you mentioned it early on that it's how we communicate science.
Mhm.
And I read a piece that you had written on the topics we were talking about. And so talk to me about this love for creative writing, and then how does this come into your work now? And of course,
Yeah,
how do
that's
you use
a.
it for communication, etc.
Where does one start? Why did I even start writing? I'm not sure. I feel like I started writing because I wanted to understand what I was learning and what I was feeling about myself and everything that was kind of happening. So I've always kept, well, not always, so since I think my first or second year of undergrad, I had a little notebook in the back of my backpack where I would just kind of take it out and just write little comics and things about what I was experiencing around me. And that kind of, as I was learning so much during my graduate school space, and both like from the technical side and just like going through these different emotional things, which led to me just learn more about myself internally, I was just trying to find avenues to kind of communicate that, just get it out of my body so it was out there somewhere in the world. And yeah, I feel like I have always had an ability to kind of just use words just eloquently, I guess, to toot my own horn, to just communicate different things. And I just don't, like, I love science, and I really just see science as another way of storytelling. I think it's really important to recognize that the scientific method is a tool set that we use to just engage and understand the world around us. It's not necessarily the only way that the world can be seen, but it is a way. And so I really try to center that because, one, it means that I'm not going to be, many people kind of use science as a hammer and a stick. It's like the science says so, that is why, but the science is not a thing. It's a process. It's a way of acquiring knowledge and learning. And so I try to make sure I center that so I don't get into the space of being too rigid and rational in the way that I navigate the world, because science is not the be all and end all. It's just one way of viewing the world. And I always try to center that within myself. And so because science is a story, I used it and applied storytelling tools to my science. And so there's a few things. I think I wrote a slam poem, probably one of the first things I presented. It was on the history of science. So this was after I was kind of learning about those colonial roots. And it was called Ideal. And it was really just talking about how science is based on us creating models of the world, but then we lose the recognition that those are just models, and we view the models as the world themselves. And that's really why we're getting into this place where we're hyper-focused on metrics and quantifying and separating and isolating and categorizing, without recognizing that the purpose of doing that is to understand the underlying picture behind it. It's not just so we can quantify things until there's nothing left for us to separate and break apart. And that was really what that first slam poem was about. And then I wrote a short story about a piece of plastic as it was being created, and I was kind of telling the story of this long chain, and it was just slowly decaying into nothingness as it slowly kind of became eroded through chemistry and different types of degradation processes. And then I've written a short story which I haven't really released anywhere, but it's called The Particle and the Wave. And it's really, it's a way of communicating, I guess, the duality of self, perhaps. Because we collectively, a particle, light is both a particle and a wave. And so when it's a wave, it flows, it can collide, combine, become destructive or constructive. When it's a particle, it can literally chip things away. It has mass and it can act upon things. It's really quite fascinating because what is two things? And when I was thinking to myself, I wrote this short story because sometimes for myself, I feel like a particle and sometimes I feel like a wave. But I feel like a particle, I feel like I'm kind of trapped in a box. I'm everyone's kind of looking at me, observing me, and I feel very small and rigid and hard. But when I'm a wave, it's kind of like when I'm on stage. It's just energy is flowing, I'm just moving, I'm actively just whatever. Nothing can kind of permeate me. And so I just wanted to express these kind of two sides of myself. And it's just called The Particle and the Wave. And So there's lots like yeah, I just try to tell these stories so that we can communicate the beauty of the world around us, but center that in like the technical quote unquote facts that we know about the world. And more recently, I've really been thinking, I kind of touched upon it, but this idea of moving from this linear, binary, categorized world into this world of quantum reality, where everything is kind of interconnected. We have the internet, for example, we have this ability to have infinite content, like all of this possibility that we now have to figure out how to find. It reminds me very much of the fact that electrons aren't actually anything. They're kind of a distribution function. So there's a probability of an electron being in a place, but it doesn't mean it's there. It could be anywhere. And so similarly, we have all of this abundance, and we have to figure out how we're going to like access the one piece that we really want. It's just really fascinating to think kind of these esoteric big questions. It really helps me understand where we want to go. And so I guess I see it, so what I've kind of ended up doing is taking these ideas. So on one side, we have systems change, and I work a lot on the technical side, like how are we going to action and implement the circular economy or the bioeconomy? So it's like, this is the system that we want. And on the other side is behavior change. And for me, that's centered around this idea of solar punk. So it's like green futures and storytelling. So how can we get people involved in co-creating this vision that we want? So we have behavior change and system change. And in between that, the work that I do is really how can we use nature or natural systems as an example or the story for the way that we want the world to be. And so what I mean by that is really just looking at one of the things I think I've been thinking about more recently is about change. And so in natural systems, like we can think about a cell growing or a human growing, you have to extend and kind of rupture, become open to grow and have that space filled by new ideas or new learnings. And that's the same for the world that we want today. We have to open ourselves up, become slightly vulnerable so that we can actually bring in that new piece of the puzzle that we want to connect. And I just like, I think about that all the time these days because I'm thinking about, okay, how can I expand my perspective or expand my business, expand my network in a way that I can bring in new ideas or new technologies, new connections so that I can learn more and grow more. And then how can we expand that to the industry as a whole? Like how can we start to open ourselves up, become a little bit vulnerable, move into a space of unknowing and uncertainty because we're open, we may not come together again, but we have to have that trust and that faith in the marketplace that we just need to bring these pieces in to allow us to actually grow and become a little bit more solid within this landscape. So yeah, so it's really just about, I think of it as biomimicry, but not necessarily biomimicry in the technologies that we use, but it's like, how do we see the world through a natural lens or a more regenerative and restorative lens? And using science all the way from biology to quantum physics to really kind of communicate that, I think gets people excited because it's just another way of storytelling at the end of the day. So
My gosh, that's beautiful. There was there's another book that came to my mind when I was listening to you, and that was one of the probably the top 10 books I've ever read. Is the A Brief History of Everything, which was Bill Bryson, and it was so much science coming together, but beautiful storytelling on how one scientist helped the another and how they coexisted at a certain time, and it was just fascinating. And I agree with you. The only way we listen and we are able to understand is through storytelling. And when you can do that, and I can totally see you sort of being able to take that idea which is complex. And then I read your work on the plastic piece, and it was fascinating, the way you talked about it. So yeah, and it made it so much more interesting. And of course then you can bring in people and communicate better. And then sadly, we have run out of time, but the conversation has been so fascinating. But I'll take it towards closure. And one of the things that I'm sure you can add a lot of light on is that the industry that we are in terms of biomaterials needs a lot of new ideas, new energy. So, what would your advice be both ways to students and how they should look at this possibility, and to companies that are looking to attract talent? How should that go about, and how should that happen so that there is more ideas coming in and more synergies
Mhm.
being formed?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think I've said most of your questions have been fantastic up to this point. But I've been doing a lot of learning around regenerative leadership most recently. And one of the key things there is about leading by learning. It's not necessarily about being out in the front and saying, this is what I think. It's about kind of stepping back and allowing people to share their thoughts and feels, and then saying, okay, I'm going to incorporate that into what I think, and then speaking. So I think as students entering this landscape, I would say, one, learn about the landscape and the businesses that you might be wanting to reach out to, and then find a space where you can apply sustainable principles or green chemistry principles no matter where you are. Even if you are a fashion designer, if you are a school teacher, if you're a bus driver, there's so many ways to incorporate sustainability just by understanding what that landscape is and then seeing how you can apply those principles. So learning and leading. If you're on the employer side or the business side, I think it's about listening and leading by listening. So recognizing that you are bringing people in so you can learn from them. You're also going to be teaching them things, but the purpose of bringing young people into an organization is not just to create more people at the middle management level. It's to help them learn about the industry so that they can use their skill set that their experiences have created to find new solutions that you would not have been able to see yourself. So I think sometimes it's we as business owners and maybe people who have a bit more experience in these landscapes will see people and say, that's not possible because of X, Y, Z. But the youth that we're bringing into our organizations don't see the limitations, they only see the possibilities. And that's the type of vision that we really want to incorporate. And so it's about listening and then providing the experience of your understanding of the market and saying, these are the things that we actually can't budge on, but here's a space where we actually can be creative and find new opportunities. So those are kind of the two perspectives that I try to bring, both when I'm entering new spaces and bringing people into my space. And it's been working so far. So
Yeah, I hope more and more people listen and think the way you are thinking on both sides, in the sense of bringing in ideas into the workspace and then creating the right leadership to attract and retain. It's both
mhm.
to have talent, because all the difference will be brought by people. Um, okay, my final two, which are usually always interesting to hear, and I'm definitely very keen to hear how you think about it. So one of the things that we started with, and the challenge, of course, if we are to solve this challenge of creating better materials, it has to be done at scale, because the convenience and what we are used to now is something that is producing. Even plastics we are producing is about 8.3 billion tons a year. So how do you see this scale idea percolating, in order to be able to really, it's more for humankind than the planet, for us to survive and to be able to be living in this beautiful space that we've been provided with. So in the next few years, say maybe we can take a perspective of a 5-year timeline. How do you see the scale developing and growing, and what would be your desire
Mhm.
that happens?
Yeah, so I'm gonna bring it back to another one of my allegories, I guess. And it's this idea of crystallization or self-assembly. So when you're growing a crystal, it starts off with one molecule, and those molecules start to align and build and build and build until you have something that's the macro size, and you're like, wow, this started from just nothingness. And so this idea of self-assembly and self-replication is having models which can be replicated many ways, many different times, but to the same success. So it's really just about, for example, there's this amazing organization here in Vancouver called Chop Value. So they take chopsticks and they form these beautiful different like furniture and other types of amazing products from that. So for them, rather than scaling and then having these global marketplaces, they scaled their business model. So now they have a chop value in multiple places around the world to be able to take the chopsticks from their communities and make beautiful products for their communities. So it's really just about how can we start to build the guiding rules and principles of our game that we can share with other people. And similar to how DNA, we all have it coded within us, but based on who our parents are, where in the world we grew up, our environment, that DNA will show us different things. But the code itself is the same. The rules are the same, but the environment in which we put those rules may be different, but it will still work in the same way. Like my heart still beats and so does yours. We're in different parts of the globe, but we still have those same rules in our DNA, which allow us to function optimally, ideally. And so it's this idea of how do we create business models for self-assembly, where we can just be providing into the marketplace this structure, this process, this model, this pilot, this case study that other people may be able to pick up on, but where the value of that model can be maintained or shared within those who have created it. It's definitely a different way of thinking about things, but we do know that we can't necessarily scale on our planet the same way. We can't have ships and planes going everywhere all the time, but we still want to have those innovations and that technology everywhere as well. So it's like, really, how can we do that? By utilizing and supporting people within their communities to really like create those things in different places. And so, yeah, that's why I see scaling for myself. And I hope that we can move towards that sort of model in the next 5 years or so as well.
Yeah, I think it's sort of our conversation is coming back again and again to holistic systems thinking,
Mhm.
right? Everything has to come together, and I hope that it will keep doing that, as morphing into that as we go along as humanity. My last question: what is good garbage to you?
Good garbage to me is transformation. And so if that garbage can be transformed into multiple different things in multiple different ways, I think that's pretty good garbage.
That's beautiful, so succinct. This has been so joyful, Love-Ese. It's like, it's the idea for me, it's been a conversation with a scientist artist. And it is so beautiful to have that. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And I know that the world needs more and more people like you. And I wish you lots and lots of success as you go forward. And I'm sure that you're going to leave this world a better place. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much.